The stage was set under a pale, frosty morning sky, the kind that made every breath sharp and every movement feel heavier. Aina, the young Apache woman, stepped cautiously from the stagecoach, her small trunk in hand, her eyes wide with a mix of awe, fear, and lingering disbelief. She had traveled hundreds of miles from her home in the desert, through winding trails and snow-dusted plains, to arrive at a place so isolated it seemed almost as if the world had forgotten it existed. This was her new home, her husband's ranch. Far from the warm sun and familiar sands of her youth, she wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, shivering not only from the biting cold, but from the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. Aina's heart pounded in her chest as she surveyed the sprawling land, a rugged expanse of snow-covered fields, bare trees, and a distant barn that looked more fortress than shelter. The wind cut through the air with a bitter edge, and for a moment she feared it might pierce straight through her bones. She had heard stories of mail-order brides, of women left to fend for themselves in unkind lands, and the fear of abandonment clutched at her throat. Then she saw him. Jackson, her husband, stood near the doorway of the main cabin. He was tall and broad-shouldered, a man molded by the unforgiving land he called home. His hair was dark, falling into his weathered face, and his eyes were a sharp gray, like storm clouds ready to unleash a torrent. There was a stoicism in his stance that made Aina's stomach twist with nerves. This was the man she was to call her husband, a stranger whose temperament she could only guess at. She felt both intimidated and strangely hopeful. The fragile thread of hope wrapped around the fear that had haunted her for years. Her feet felt rooted to the frozen ground as she approached him, each step seeming to echo in the silent morning. She tried to steady her breathing, to push away the memories of homes abandoned, promises broken, and the loneliness that had followed her like a shadow all her life. Deep inside, a quiet, trembling plea formed in her mind. "You can hurt me, but please don't leave me cold again." She whispered it softly, as if saying it aloud might summon the ghosts of her past, but it also gave her courage. Jackson's gaze remained steady, assessing her without words. He was a man of few expressions, his life carved out of labor, grit, and survival. Aina wondered what he thought as he looked at her. Was he disappointed? Was he indifferent? Or did he see the tremor of fear and hope in her eyes? She swallowed hard and forced herself to meet his gaze, hoping that whatever judgment he passed, he would also see a flicker of resilience, a spark that refused to break despite all she had endured. The first moments together were quiet, almost painfully so. Aina could hear the crunch of snow beneath her boots and the distant call of a lone hawk circling overhead. Jackson made no effort to reach for her trunk. Instead, he simply nodded toward the cabin, a silent instruction that this was her new life now, harsh and unwelcoming as it might be. Aina stepped inside, feeling the warmth of the small cabin envelope her, though it was not yet enough to thaw the chill inside her heart. As she set down her trunk, Aina realized the reality of her situation. There would be no immediate comfort, no instant assurance. This was a place of isolation, where every day would test her strength, her patience, and her courage. But beneath her fear, a fragile determination began to grow. She would endure, she would adapt, and she would survive because she had no choice, and because somewhere deep within she longed to be seen, to be held, to be more than just another lonely soul adrift in a frozen world. Aina's whisper, almost a prayer, lingered in the air. "You can hurt me, but please don't leave me cold again." And as she met Jackson's unwavering gaze, she felt the first tremors of a connection, however tentative, forming between them, a bond that would be tested, strained, and ultimately shaped by the harsh land, their pasts, and the fragile warmth of human trust. The days following Aina's arrival were a study in contrasts. She was warm inside the cabin but cold in spirit, caught between fear and the faintest glimmer of hope. Jackson, meanwhile, seemed determined to remain a rigid pillar of authority, as if the very land had sculpted him into unyielding stone. Each morning, Aina awoke to the chill of the cabin, the wind whistling through gaps in the wooden walls, and the daunting knowledge that her days would be filled with labor she had never imagined. The tasks of ranch life, feeding the livestock, mending fences, chopping firewood, were foreign to her delicate hands, and the ache that followed each attempt left her both frustrated and ashamed. Jackson's patience was thin, his words sharp, though seldom cruel. "Lift it like this," he would bark, showing her how to hoist a bale of hay. Or, "Pay attention, it's not the way you're doing it," when she fumbled with the reins of a stubborn horse. Aina's attempts at obedience often fell short, her inexperience apparent, and Jackson's irritation would rise like smoke from a smoldering fire. Yet, there was a method in his brusqueness, a tough-love approach that masked a careful attention to her well-being. He could not show gentleness yet, and she could not yet trust it even if he did. Their first serious clash occurred on a biting morning, when a stubborn mule refused to move despite Aina's coaxing. Her frustration bubbled over. "It's impossible," she shouted, cheeks burning with cold and humiliation. Jackson stepped forward, voice low but firm. "It's not impossible. You're just doing it wrong." Aina's eyes flashed with defiance. "And maybe you're too hard on me," she shot back, her words trembling with a mix of fear and anger. For a moment, the two faced each other like opposing forces, neither willing to yield. The cabin felt smaller somehow, the wind outside more accusing, and the distance between them seemed to stretch wider with every word. Aina wanted to flee, to escape back to the life she had lost, but she stayed, rooted by the thought that running would only leave her more vulnerable. Jackson's eyes softened ever so, slightly, not enough to betray full warmth, but enough to hint at the man beneath the rugged exterior. "I'm not trying to hurt you," he said gruffly, though the words came out rougher than intended. "I'm trying to make sure you survive out here." "You can't survive if you stay soft." Aina stared at him, a flicker of something unrecognizable passing through her, perhaps understanding, perhaps fear, perhaps hope. She realized that his harshness was a language she had yet to learn, a way to communicate care in a world that was unforgiving. And yet, the sting of his words cut deep, awakening old wounds from a life where love and protection were never guaranteed. Her plea whispered again, this time in the solitude of her mind. "You can hurt me, but please don't leave me cold again." Despite the friction, moments of quiet observation allowed Aina to notice the subtle care Jackson provided. He repaired the tears in her coat without her asking, left extra wood stacked near the cabin stove, and never let the livestock go hungry. His stoicism, she began to realize, was not indifference but armor. Just as her own fear had taught her caution, his silence masked a cautious concern. By the end of that day, Aina was exhausted, muscles aching, and pride bruised. Yet, she also felt a strange, tenuous connection forming, a bond that was forged not in warmth or affection but in shared struggle and the unspoken acknowledgement of mutual survival. They were two strangers, bound by circumstance and a harsh land, learning each other's rhythms through conflict and endurance. As night fell, Aina sat by the small fire, staring into its flickering light. She allowed herself a quiet sigh of relief, knowing she had survived the day. Somewhere deep inside, a fragile seed of trust had been planted. She whispered once more into the stillness of the cabin, "You can hurt me, but please don't leave me cold again." And for the first time, she wondered if perhaps, just perhaps, Jackson might hear it in his own way, and choose not to leave her to the chill. The wind howled relentlessly outside the cabin, rattling the shutters and driving icy gusts through every crevice. Aina wrapped herself tighter in her thin shawl, the fire sputtering weakly in the hearth. Despite the modest warmth, she could feel the chill creeping into her bones. A cold that was more than physical, it gnawed at her heart, whispering memories of nights when she had been left alone, abandoned and shivering, both in body and in spirit. Her lips trembled, not from the cold, but from the weight of loneliness that had clung to her like a second skin dot. It was then that she heard the mules braying outside, a reminder that the world beyond the cabin continued its harsh demands. Gathering what courage she had, Aina wrapped herself in her shawl and stepped out to fetch water from the well, the snow crunching beneath her boots with every careful step. Her hands, small and unpracticed, struggled with the bucket, teeth chattering despite her best efforts to keep them warm. The water froze in spots as she carried it back to the cabin, and she realized she had overestimated her own strength in this unforgiving landscape. By the time she returned, Jackson had noticed her absence. He followed her footsteps through the snow, moving swiftly, the leather of his boots stiff with frost. He reached her just as she was placing the bucket inside, the cold and exertion making her tremble uncontrollably. "Aina," he said, his voice sharp at first, but tinged with concern. "You can't be out here alone in this weather." She tried to shrug it off, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine," she murmured, but the truth was undeniable. Her fingers were numb, her body aching, and fear prickled at her like ice under the skin. Jackson stepped closer, his hands rough but warm as he took hers. Gently, deliberately, he led her inside, shutting the door against the storm. The warmth of the cabin hit her like a wave, but it was not enough to melt the cold that lingered in her chest. Jackson's gaze softened as he set the bucket aside and helped her to the hearth. "Sit," he said simply, gesturing to the edge of the worn rug. Aina obeyed, lowering herself carefully, watching as he adjusted the firewood to produce a steadier flame. The silence stretched between them, heavy but not hostile. It was a silence that invited words, though neither knew quite how to begin. Aina shivered, not from the cold but from the vulnerability of the moment. She felt as if the walls she had built around herself, the armor forged from loss and betrayal, were beginning to crack. Her voice came out quiet, hesitant. "I've never lived in a place like this," she admitted, eyes fixed on the dancing flames. "The cold, it feels endless. And the loneliness, it's like it wraps around you and never lets go." Jackson did not respond immediately. He sat across from her, his expression unreadable. Though Aina could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands rested lightly on his knees, betraying a man unused to emotional displays. "The land is harsh," he said finally, his voice low. "It doesn't forgive weakness, but it can teach endurance. You'll learn. We'll survive it together." The words, simple as they were, reached Aina in a way she hadn't anticipated. She felt a lump rise in her throat, a mixture of relief and fear that he might leave her again, emotionally as well as physically. Her hands instinctively found his, gripping them lightly, seeking warmth but also reassurance. "You can hurt me," she whispered, almost inaudibly, "but please, don't leave me cold again." Jackson looked down at her hands, then into her eyes, and for a moment, the world outside seemed to vanish, the storm, the snow, the weight of isolation all eclipsed by the fragile connection forming here in the flickering firelight. Though he did not speak, his clasp around her hands tightened slightly, a subtle promise of protection. Aina, feeling the sincerity in that silent gesture, allowed herself to lean back against the rug, to let the warmth of the fire and the presence of another human being seep into her bones. For the first time since her journey began, she realized that survival was no longer just about enduring the cold or completing the chores. It was about trust. And in that quiet night, amidst the relentless storm, Aina understood that she had taken the first small step towards something far more dangerous, far more vital than mere survival, the possibility of being seen, cared for, and perhaps eventually loved. Even as the first rays of morning crept weakly over the snow-laden plains, Aina found herself unable to shake the memories that had haunted her for years. She sat by the small cabin window, hands wrapped around a mug of tepid coffee, eyes tracing the icy patterns that formed on the glass. Outside, the wind tore across the land, relentless and indifferent. But it was the storm inside her mind that made her feel colder than the winter ever could. Her thoughts drifted back to the desert, where she had grown up, a place of sun-baked earth and shifting sands that had once seemed endless and forgiving. That illusion had been shattered long ago. She remembered the night her village had been attacked, the screams echoing in the darkness, and the helplessness she had felt as her family was torn from her. Her mother's hand had been warm in hers, and then suddenly it had been gone, leaving her alone and trembling in the cold. The memory clawed at her chest with relentless precision, and she shivered not from the cold outside, but from the raw ache of loss. Aina's mind wandered through the years of wandering, of people who had promised safety but instead delivered pain. She remembered the deceitful merchant who had claimed to help her reach a better life, only to abandon her to strangers. She remembered nights curled in doorways, trying to hold back tears, trying to convince herself that if she endured long enough, anyone might care. Each betrayal had left a scar, an invisible armor of caution and suspicion that she had wrapped tightly around her heart. Now, here she was, standing on the threshold of yet another life with another stranger, Jackson, the stoic rancher whose face rarely betrayed his thoughts. She wanted to trust him, to believe that perhaps this time would be different, but the memories of abandonment were a constant echo. Every glare, every stern word, even every unspoken glance reminded her of past hurt. Yet alongside the fear, there was a flicker of hope. Fragile and almost imperceptible, that maybe, just maybe, someone could see her scars and not recoil from them. Jackson, in the meantime, noticed small signs of her unease. He saw the way she flinched at sudden noises, the snap of a branch, the clatter of a bucket. He saw how her hands trembled when she thought he wasn't looking. It reminded him, in ways he did not fully understand, of his own vulnerabilities. Though he had spent years forging a life of hard labor and emotional restraint, he recognized the shadow of pain in her eyes, the kind of pain that refused to be masked. It unnerved him, and yet it drew him closer. Aina, sensing his quiet scrutiny, felt a mixture of shame and relief. She was unaccustomed to being observed with patience rather than judgment. Jackson's silence spoke volumes. It told her that he might not abandon her in the same way the world had, but she could not yet be certain. She had been burned before so many times that the notion of safety felt both foreign and frightening. Still, a stubborn part of her heart insisted that she try. After all, survival was not only about enduring the cold or mastering the labor of the land, it was about learning to trust again, even if the process was painful and slow. That evening, as the wind rattled the cabin and shadows danced across the walls, Aina opened her heart just a little more. She spoke softly of her past, allowing fragments of memory to surface: the fear, the loneliness, the betrayals that had defined her early years. Jackson listened, wordless but present, a steady anchor in the turbulence of her confession. She realized that by speaking, by risking the raw exposure of her soul, she was taking the first steps toward letting someone in, toward dismantling the armor she had carried for so long. For Aina, the past was not a mere recollection, it was a living, breathing presence that threatened to engulf her in despair. But in Jackson's quiet attentiveness, she found the first glimmer of hope, that perhaps, in this remote, harsh land, she could finally find someone who would not leave her cold. And in that flickering candlelight, with the snow pressing against the window, Aina whispered once more resolutely than before, "You can hurt me, but please don't leave me cold again." The mornings grew brighter, though the land remained unyielding, a frozen expanse that tested both patience and endurance. Aina had begun to settle into the rhythms of ranch life, though every task still carried a weight of uncertainty. Each bale of hay lifted, each stubborn mule guided, each splintering fence repaired was a battle against both the harsh environment and her own lingering fears. Yet amidst the labor, small victories began to emerge, victories not only over the land, but over the invisible chains of doubt and mistrust that had long bound her heart. Jackson observed her quietly, a steady presence on the periphery of her efforts. He rarely spoke words of praise, but his guidance was precise and unhurried. "Keep your weight forward," he would say as she struggled to saddle a horse. Or, "Watch the mule's ears, they tell you what it wants," as she tried to coax the stubborn animal forward. Aina noticed that his words, though blunt, were always paired with action. He demonstrated patiently, correcting mistakes without belittling her. Each small correction, each careful gesture, carried a message she had rarely encountered in her life, that care could coexist with firmness. One afternoon, Jackson asked her to help with a task that had always seemed impossible to Aina, mending a fence along the farthest edge of the property. She hesitated, aware of her limited skill, but the steadiness in his gaze encouraged her. Together, they lifted heavy planks, hammered posts into the frozen soil, and laughed quietly at missteps that would have once caused her frustration to flare into tears. Aina realized that she was learning not just the mechanics of ranch life, but also a rhythm of partnership, a way to move in tandem with someone else, to share both effort and space. During a break, Aina wiped the sweat from her brow, noting the way Jackson's eyes softened in those rare, unguarded moments. She had begun to perceive the subtle ways he cared for her, the repaired tear in her coat that had once let in the cold, the careful stacking of firewood she hadn't yet noticed, the way he never left her alone when the weather turned harsh. Each of these small acts, seemingly mundane, began to chip away at the wall she had built around her heart. She began to see that trust, much like the fence they were building, required time, patience, and steady effort. In the evenings, Aina found herself lingering by the fire, reflecting on the day's progress. Jackson would sit nearby, silent, but the quiet was no longer oppressive, it was companionable. She would speak softly, recounting her experiences, her failures, her moments of courage, and he would listen without interruption, occasionally offering advice or a brief acknowledgement. Aina felt the slow, steady pulse of connection growing between them. She realized that trust was not about immediate warmth or grand gestures. It was about consistency, presence, and reliability. One night, as the snow fell heavily against the cabin walls, Aina ventured to share a memory from her childhood, one she had rarely spoken of. Her voice trembled as she recounted a time when she had been left alone for days after losing her family, surviving only by sheer stubbornness and courage. Jackson listened intently, his expression guarded but attentive. When she finished, he simply nodded, a subtle acknowledgement of her strength and suffering. Aina felt a warmth she had not experienced in years, not the heat of fire, but the warmth of being seen, truly seen, without judgment. By the end of the week, Aina could ride the horse with more confidence, tend the livestock without fear, and even predict the movements of the animals she had once struggled to control. More importantly, she had learned to rely on Jackson in small ways, to accept his guidance, to let him share the burden of work, and to recognize his quiet care. The bond between them, tentative and fragile, was no longer just about survival. It was about the possibility of mutual respect, patience, and slowly, perhaps, something resembling affection. As Aina lay in bed that night, Gazing at the wooden ceiling above, she whispered once more, almost reflexively, "You can hurt me, but please don't leave me cold again." This time, the words felt less like a plea and more like a test of something deeper, an acknowledgement that trust was growing, delicate as the frost on the cabin window, yet strong enough to begin thawing the icy shadows of her past. The crisp morning air carried an uneasy tension across the valley. Aina rose early, the snow still glistening under the faint light of dawn, and noticed the ridgelines to the west seemed darker than usual, shadowed with the weight of approaching danger. She had grown accustomed to the harshness of the land, but she could sense when something was off. Jackson, already outside tending the livestock, moved with a sharpness that immediately set her on edge. "Jackson?" she called, her voice tentative. He looked up, his expression unreadable, the set of his jaw tighter than usual. "Is something wrong?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he gestured for her to follow as he walked toward the barn. Aina felt the chill of unease crawling down her spine. She had learned in the weeks since her arrival that Jackson's instincts were precise. When he was concerned, it was never idle worry. Today, his concern carried weight. As they neared the barn, the sound of distant shouts and the clatter of hooves echoed across the valley. Aina's heart leapt into her throat as she realized the threat. A rival rancher, a man notorious in the region for greed and violence, was attempting to drive Jackson off his land. Panic surged, and she felt her hands tremble. In the past, she might have turned and run, frozen in fear, but something had shifted. She did not run. Jackson's presence was a protective force she had never known before. He barked instructions to Aina, calm but firm. "Help secure the livestock," he ordered. "Move quickly, but stay close to me." His hand rushed briefly against hers, a grounding touch that sent a small shock of reassurance through her. Aina realized as she moved alongside him that fear could coexist with courage, and that sometimes the presence of someone you trusted made all the difference in facing danger. The rival rancher's men approached, shouting threats, demanding Jackson abandon his property. Aina watched, wide-eyed, as Jackson confronted them. There was a fierce intensity in his gray eyes, a controlled rage that left no room for negotiation. She had seen his stoicism before, but this was different. This was fire beneath the ice, a determination to protect what mattered at all costs. In that moment, Aina understood that while his hands could be stern, even harsh, they could also shield her from harm. As the confrontation escalated, Aina found herself trembling not from fear, but from awe. Jackson's strength, both physical and moral, impressed upon her the reality that she was not alone. She had survived abandonment, betrayal, and harsh winters, but she had never known the assurance that someone would fight for her as he was doing now. She saw the depth of care in his actions, even though his words remained few. It was in the way he positioned himself between her and the threat, the way he scanned for danger, the way he gave orders that ensured her safety without dismissing her presence entirely. The rival men eventually retreated, recognizing Jackson's unyielding resolve. The snow-swept valley returned to a tense quiet, the echoes of the skirmish fading into the wind. Aina exhaled, relief mingling with adrenaline, and turned to see Jackson standing nearby, his expression calm but alert, the tension in his shoulders slowly easing. "Are you hurt?" Aina asked, concern lacing her voice. "Not yet," he replied, his tone almost gruff, but there was a faint softness in the way he glanced at her. Aina realized then that the danger had not only tested his strength, but had revealed a truth she had been craving, that he was willing to protect her, fiercely and unwaveringly. The warmth of that realization, fragile yet profound, spread through her, thawing some of the fear that had always accompanied her. As they returned to the cabin together, Aina allowed herself a small, private smile. The storm outside had passed, but inside her a quiet change had occurred. She had witnessed Jackson's protective strength, and it had reshaped the fragile trust between them. She whispered once more, this time with renewed conviction, "You can hurt me, but please don't leave me cold again." And for the first time, she believed that perhaps he never would. The tension that had been simmering for weeks finally erupted on a late afternoon when the wind brought more than just cold, it carried frustration, fatigue, and emotions neither Aina nor Jackson had fully addressed. Aina had been trying to herd a particularly stubborn group of cattle across the snow-packed field. Despite her growing skills, the animals refused to move in the direction she intended, and the bitter wind stung her face and hands, making her movements sluggish and clumsy. Jackson arrived, as he often did, to guide her. But instead of calm instruction, fatigue and irritation surfaced in his voice. "You're forcing them wrong. You have to move with them, not against them." He barked, his words sharper than usual. Aina froze, feeling both insulted and humiliated. Her cheeks burned not from the cold, but from the sting of his criticism. "I am moving with them." She snapped back, her voice cracking under the strain. "Maybe, if you weren't yelling, I could think." Jackson's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. The air between them became almost unbearable, the snow around them fading into insignificance compared to the storm building in their hearts. "You don't understand," he shouted. "Out here, mistakes cost more than pride. They cost survival." Aina's anger flared, mingling with the remnants of fear that always lurked beneath her surface. "I'm trying my best, Jackson. Do you think I want to fail?" Her voice trembled, and she turned abruptly, storming away across the snow, the bitter wind whipping her shawl around her. For a heartbeat, Jackson stood frozen, his chest heaving. He had not expected her to leave, had not planned for her fear and pride to clash so violently with his insistence on control. But as the distance grew between them, panic clawed at him. He couldn't let her run off into the cold alone, not after all the small steps they had taken together. Not after the fragile trust that had been building week by week. Aina ran blindly, her legs sinking into the thick snow, her mind a storm of hurt, fear, and memories she had tried to bury. Every step carried the weight of years of abandonment, the nights she had spent shivering, unseen, waiting for someone to return, waiting for someone to care. Tears blurred her vision, freezing in the cold air before they could fall. She wanted to scream, to release all the frustration pent up inside her, but all that came out was a low, trembling sob. Jackson pursued her, boots crunching through the snow, each step measured but urgent. "Aina, stop," he called, his voice rough, carrying both authority and desperation. When she didn't respond, he quickened his pace, the fear that he might lose her overriding every other instinct. He found her near the edge of the frozen stream, staring blankly at the ice, shoulders shaking. He approached slowly, hands outstretched, giving her space yet offering reassurance. "Aina," he said quietly, voice firm but gentle, "you're not alone. I'm here." She looked up, eyes wide, the storm inside her mirrored in his gray gaze. The distance they had tried to maintain, the emotional wall she had built, and the stoicism he had upheld crumbled in that moment. "I'm scared, Jackson," she admitted, voice breaking. "Scared of being left. Of being cold, alone." Jackson knelt beside her, ignoring the snow seeping into his boots, and placed his rough hands over hers. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, and this time the words were soft but unwavering. "You're not alone. Not now, not ever." Aina felt a trembling relief wash over her. For the first time, she allowed herself to lean into someone's presence completely, to acknowledge that fear could coexist with trust. The cold wind that had seemed relentless moments ago now felt less biting, tempered by the warmth of connection. That night, they returned to the cabin silently, side by side. Words were unnecessary. The understanding between them spoke volumes. Aina whispered once again, almost to herself, "You can hurt me, but please don't leave me cold again." And this time, Jackson didn't just hear it. He responded with a glance, a squeeze of her hand, and a promise, unspoken but as solid as the frozen earth beneath their feet. The next morning, the cabin felt quieter than usual. Aina sat by the small hearth, wrapped in her shawl, her hands cupped around a steaming mug of coffee. Outside, the snow lay thick and pristine, reflecting the pale light of dawn, but inside, there was a different kind of thaw taking place, a gradual melting of fear and distance. After the events of the previous night, Aina felt raw yet strangely lighter, as if unspoken burdens had begun to lift. Jackson entered quietly, carrying a small bundle of firewood. He set it down and paused, watching her without a word. Aina felt his gaze, steady and calm, and a nervous warmth spread through her chest. She had grown accustomed to his stoicism, the wall he maintained between himself and the world, but now she sensed a subtle shift. The silence between them was no longer tension-filled, it was expectant, almost tender. Finally, Aina spoke, her voice tentative. "Jackson, last night, when I ran, I realized something. I've spent so much of my life hiding, protecting myself, keeping people at a distance. And yet, I've never known someone who would truly try to reach me, even when I pushed them away." Her words trembled with honesty, and she dared to glance up. Jackson's eyes softened ever so slightly, revealing a glimpse of the man beneath the rugged exterior. He sat across from her, and for a moment neither spoke. Then, slowly, carefully, he began to share pieces of his own past stories he had rarely told anyone. He spoke of losing his parents when he was young, of growing up on this harsh land, where survival was learned through grit rather than guidance. He spoke of relationships that had ended in betrayal or misunderstanding, of the loneliness that had become a familiar companion. Aina listened, her heart aching for the man whose strength had shielded her, but whose vulnerability mirrored her own. For the first time, Aina realized that Jackson's harshness, his strictness, and his stoicism were not signs of indifference, but armor built to survive a world that had often been cruel. And just as her own armor had been forged from fear and abandonment, his had been shaped by loss and solitude. In that understanding, a bridge began to form, a fragile but growing connection that neither had experienced in years. Aina reached for his hand, tentative at first, and then with increasing confidence. His rough palm enveloped hers, and she felt a warmth that had little to do with the fire. "I've been hurt before," she admitted softly, "but I want to trust again." "With you?" Jackson's gaze held hers, steady and unflinching. "You can," he said quietly. "I won't leave you in the cold. Not now. Not ever." The words, simple yet profound, resonated in the quiet cabin like a promise, a balm to the wounds Aina had carried for so long. They sat together, hands entwined, as the snow continued to fall outside. The warmth of the fire mingled with the warmth of presence, creating a cocoon against the harshness of the world. Aina realized that healing was not about grand gestures or instant transformation. It was about these small moments of connection, of vulnerability met with patience, of fear met with steadfast reassurance. Hours passed as they shared fragments of their lives' stories of childhood, moments of loss, memories of pain. Laughter, soft and tentative, punctuated the conversation, and Aina felt something she had not known in years: safety. Not safety from the cold or the world, but safety within the presence of another human being who understood, accepted, and chose to remain. As the evening descended, Aina leaned back slightly, allowing herself to absorb the moment. The fear of abandonment, the lingering shivers of the past, seemed less oppressive. Jackson's steady hand and careful attention offered more than physical. Warmth it offered the promise of emotional security, a rare and precious gift she had never allowed herself to receive. Aina whispered again, this time with calm certainty, "You can hurt me, but please don't leave me cold again." Jackson's response was subtle but unmistakable, a slow squeeze of her hand, a nod, and a shared silence that spoke louder than words. In that moment, they began to heal together, one touch, one word, one shared memory at a time. The harsh landscape outside contrasting with the fragile warmth blooming between them. The first signs of spring were subtle, almost imperceptible in the frozen expanse of the valley. Snow still clung stubbornly to the ground, and the wind retained its sharp bite. But there were hints of change. The ice along the stream had begun to fracture, and the sun lingered longer in the pale sky. Aina noticed these shifts with a sense of quiet wonder, the landscape mirroring the thaw slowly taking place in her own heart. Ranch life had become a rhythm they shared. Aina moved with more confidence now, tending to livestock, mending fences, and riding the horses without hesitation. She still faltered occasionally, still felt the sting of failure in her early mornings, but she no longer faced those moments alone. Jackson was there, not hovering, but present, steady, and patient. The small, consistent gestures of care he had shown before had grown into something more, a partnership built on trust, mutual respect, and an unspoken bond that neither dared to name aloud. On this particular morning, they worked together to repair a collapsed section of fence near the northern pasture. Aina lifted a plank with practiced strength while Jackson hammered it into place. The sound of the hammer striking wood echoed across the valley, mingling with the soft calls of cattle and the occasional bird overhead. Aina looked at Jackson, noting the relaxed set of his shoulders and the faint, almost imperceptible curve of his mouth. It struck her that she had not felt fear in his presence for some time, only confidence and quiet reassurance. During a brief pause, Aina leaned against the fence post, letting the sun warm her face. She watched Jackson tighten the last bolt and, almost instinctively, reached for his hand. He looked up, surprised for a moment, then allowed their fingers to entwine. No words were spoken. None were needed. In that touch, Aina felt the culmination of weeks of small steps, the patience, the care, the moments of vulnerability they had shared, the unspoken promise that neither would leave the other to face the cold alone. Later that day, they took a break near the stream, watching the ice crack and drift downstream. Aina found herself laughing softly at a playful exchange with Jackson over a stubborn mule. The sound light and unexpected even to her own ears. She realized she hadn't laughed so freely in years, not since before the losses that had shaped her life. Jackson's eyes met hers, and he smiled faintly in return, a small, careful smile, but enough to make her heart flutter. The ice, both literal and metaphorical, was breaking down as the days passed. They faced other minor challenges, a sudden snowstorm that trapped them in the barn, a sick calf that needed careful tending, and the relentless demands of daily ranch work. Each trial was met together, their teamwork growing more natural, their reliance on one another seamless. Aina no longer hesitated to ask for help, and Jackson no longer felt the need to mask every flicker of care with stoicism. In these small battles, trust became habit and trust became warmth. One evening, after a long day of work, Aina sat by the fire, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, and watched Jackson as he repaired a section of saddle. She marveled at the way he had softened, how the barriers they both had erected were slowly dissolving in the heat of shared effort and consistent care. She realized that the cold that had once defined her life, the cold of abandonment, betrayal, and fear was now something she could face with him at her side. As night fell, Aina spoke softly, almost to herself, her words carrying the weight of months of fear and hope. "You can hurt me, but please don't leave me cold again." Jackson looked up from his work, eyes meeting hers, and this time there was no hesitation, no guardedness. He stepped closer and placed his hand over hers, a grounding touch, a promise unspoken yet understood. The winter may have lingered outside, but within the cabin a profound warmth had taken root. They had survived the cold together, not just the frozen land, but the emotional frost that had shadowed their hearts. Aina leaned back, finally allowing herself to fully absorb the moment. The thaw was not only in the valley or the stream, it was in them, in their hearts, and in the quiet certainty that neither would be left alone again. The valley was bathed in the soft, golden light of late afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky as if reluctant to leave the snow-covered land. The cold had not completely receded, but the harshness of winter had softened, leaving a fragile beauty in its place. Aina and Jackson stood side by side on a small rise overlooking the ranch, their breath steaming in the crisp air. The silence between them was comfortable, filled not with tension or fear, but with the quiet assurance of shared experience and hard-won trust. Aina's eyes roamed over the landscape, the fences they had repaired, the livestock grazing peacefully, the tracks in the snow that marked their days of work and struggle. It was a view she had once approached with fear and doubt, a frozen expanse that mirrored the chill she felt inside. But now, standing beside Jackson, she felt a warmth she had never known before. It was a warmth born not from the fire in the cabin, nor from sunlight, but from the steadfast presence of another human being who had chosen to stay through storms, hardship, and vulnerability. Jackson's hand brushed against hers, a gentle, grounding touch that conveyed more than words ever could. He had never been a man of declarations or romantic flourishes. His love was quiet, practical, and enduring. But Aina understood that this hand resting in hers, steady and unwavering, carried the promise she had sought for so long, a promise of protection, presence, and care. She turned her gaze to him, her voice barely above a whisper, yet filled with conviction. "You can hurt me, but please don't leave me cold again." It was no longer a plea born of desperation. It was a statement of trust, a recognition of the bond they had forged through hardship, fear, and shared vulnerability. Jackson's gray eyes softened, and for the first time, he allowed himself to show the depth of his feeling without reservation. "I won't," he replied simply, his voice low but unwavering. No grand promises, no flourish of words, just the quiet certainty that he would stand by her, no matter the storms that lay ahead. Aina felt a shiver, not from the cold, but from relief and gratitude, a profound recognition that her heart could finally rest. They walked together down the slope toward the cabin, boots crunching over snow that had softened into wet slush, the rhythm of their steps a metaphor for the life they were building together, steady, aligned, and deliberate. Aina glanced at Jackson, noticing the way the sun caught the edges of his hair, the relaxed set of his shoulders, the unspoken pride in their shared accomplishments. The ranch no longer seemed a hostile place. It had become a home, a canvas upon which they would continue to paint the story of their lives together. Inside the cabin, the fire burned warmly, casting a golden glow over the rough wooden walls. Aina hung her coat and shawl, the chill of the day finally receding from her fingers and toes. Jackson moved to tend the stove, ensuring the cabin would be warm through the evening. They exchanged no words about the hardships of the past months, the arguments, the fears, the nights of vulnerability, but both knew that those moments had been necessary. Each had chipped away at the barriers they had built, leaving a foundation of trust and understanding stronger than either could have imagined. Sitting together by the hearth, Hands intertwined, Aina allowed herself to lean into Jackson's presence fully. The fear of abandonment that had haunted her for so long, the cold that had once seemed inevitable, had been replaced with the warmth of connection, reliability, and love. She realized that the cold she had feared was not simply the winter outside, but the loneliness of facing life without someone steadfast at her side. And now she knew she would never face it alone. As twilight settled over the valley, Aina rested her head lightly against Jackson's shoulder. The snow-covered ranch outside glimmered in the fading light, and the warmth within the cabin mirrored the growing certainty in her heart. "You can hurt me, but please don't leave me cold again," she whispered, now a statement of hope rather than fear. Jackson pressed a hand to hers, then to her back, a silent reaffirmation of his promise. In the harsh, unforgiving land that had once tested them, they had found not only survival, but a love and trust that would endure. Together, they would face every winter, every storm, and every trial not as strangers, but as partners bound by shared struggle, courage, and the unbreakable warmth of the heart.